Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk Climate, a weekly webcast series from ecoAmerica featuring dynamic discussions with local and national leaders. We offer diverse perspectives and bring forth the latest thinking and best practices for building public support and political resolve for equitable climate solutions in the U.S. Please engage with us online using the hashtag Let's Talk Climate. I'm Reverend Carol Devine. I am an ordained minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and I'm the director of BlessedTomorrow, a program here at ecoAmerica. And I am honored and so excited to be joined today by two farmers. Raphi graduated from high school last year and is taking a gap year to work on organic farms before starting Princeton this fall. She is currently working in Wisconsin. Justin Goldstein has spent most of his adult life as a rabbi, faithfully following God, teaching, preaching, pastoring, and now serves God as a farmer. Both Raphi and Justin farm in a way that is healing in their spirits and for the earth. Welcome to you both. I'm so excited to be with you today. So, as I may have mentioned, I was raised by a mother and grandmother who were environmentalists. I have grown up my whole life being what I would consider a tree hugger. That has been important to how I eat, how I live. But it wasn't until actually I was in seminary that my faith and my activism and how I live my life in terms of the environment and climate came together. And it was a very profound moment for me, actually. And I'm just wondering if you all had some connection that happened where you were like, aha, this is how I'm called to live out my faith, or was this something that, as long as you can remember, was connected for you? Like, what was it that made you want to farm and for that to be a way that you connect with your faith? Raphi, you want to start us?
Yeah, sure. That's such a great question to kick us off with. I feel very grateful actually that nature and farming and things like that and Judaism went really hand in hand for me growing up. From the time I was in elementary school, basically since I can remember, I was taught Jewish values like tikkun olam, which means repairing the world, chesed, acts of loving kindness, lador vador, passing down the earth and our tradition from generation to generation to generation. And all of these values kind of went hand in hand with actions. So we would plant seeds for gardens on our school property. And we would leave those for the next generation of students to watch them grow. I went to this Jewish sleepaway camp in the Colorado Rockies, which was a very nature-focused camp, and we prayed in the woods on our backpacking trips, and we would watch the sun poke up from behind the mountains while we were praying. So I would work on my camp's farm and say blessings or brachot over the vegetables that we grew before we ate them. So all of those things kind of went right together for me growing up. And I was really lucky that I didn't really need to make that connection myself. It was always there. And the two were never separate for me. So it really just made sense. But I guess for those of you who don't have such an organic way to connect the two, it's really easy. You don't have to look too hard to find those kinds of connections. And I actually did have a few aha moments after joining the Jewish Youth Climate Movement, which I helped to found a couple of years ago in 2019. It's a movement of fellow Jewish climate activists. So a lot of us are coming from kind of similar backgrounds. But I started seeing the connections to climate and to agriculture, not just in the way that I was living my own life, but also tangibly in the actual Torah, because Judaism is a fundamentally based in agriculture religion. It's based around the cycles of nature. For example, on many of our holidays, we use fruits that are available to us, like during that particular season as part of our rituals. There's also the practice of Shemitah, in which we let the land rest. We don't work it once every 7 years. And there are specific things that God tells Adam or Adam, saying, tend to the earth and guard it, or be careful not to destroy my world. Things like that are right in the very beginning of the Torah. So you definitely don't have to look very hard in Jewish scripture to find inspiration for stewarding the land, which I really appreciate. And I had some aha moments after joining JYCM around that. But at the same time, the two have really gone hand in hand for me, which is really helpful in a line of work like climate work, which can often be very tumultuous. It's
Yeah.
been nice to kind of have something stable like religion to turn to in times like that. So yeah, I'm wondering how Justin has experienced it.
It is a very good question, Carolyn. Thank you for having us in this discussion. Anytime that I see the language expressed of how do you connect your faith to whatever, I think it's important to understand just a cultural distinction between Jewish cultural wisdom and other faith expressions, that there is no word in Hebrew that can be translated to have faith. Right? It's a verb. It's something that you do, right? So what Raphi is describing of the educational, cultural, and social environment in which those ideas are simply natural and organic, to use the language that Raphi used, is an expression of what it means to be a part of a cultural transmission of wisdom that really focuses on behavior more than belief.
Yes.
And so I think growing up, I had no reason to connect my sense of Jewish identity to any other part of how I experienced the world that wasn't directly related. And I did not grow up going to synagogue. I did not grow up going to camps. I didn't grow up going to Hebrew school, which is your typical Jewish American experience by numbers, right? To not have those structures. And I did grow up what I would say is the edge of rural in north of Chicago, and watched farms and prairie become transformed into strip malls and business centers. And the landscape today is not recognizable to what it was when I was growing up there years ago. And many of those aha moments, I think, of those connections between Jewish wisdom and Jewish values, and what does it look like in the 20th and 21st century to be a steward of the earth and creation, were retrospective, right? And always bound into the question of land stewardship, and one's relationship to their Jewish identity is also the relationship to divorce from homeland and the cultural expression of exile, and the historic experience of many Jewish families over generations of not having the ability to steward land.
Yes.
And so much of the process of going beyond the agricultural connections between the holidays and the Torah and the climate cycles of the Near East and the Middle East today, understanding that part of the reason that we don't have those cultural expressions of farming in our recent history is a part of healing trauma.
Yeah.
And we are seeing people Raphi's age, younger, slightly older, shifting towards expressing their Jewish identity through their relationship to creation, through their relationship to environmentalism, to climate activism, and specifically to farming, in numbers that is relatively revolutionary for the Jewish historic experience. And so for me, it was really an unfolding process of coming to an understanding of what these identities mean for me in my life. And like you were saying, of describing yourself as a tree hugger, that was so much of my identity growing up. It just made sense. You protect the earth that feeds you, right, and shift your diet accordingly, and all of those different practices. And so it's beautiful. I've known so many people who have come to their environmental awareness through their connection to Jewish wisdom. And I think that I came into my relationship with Jewish wisdom largely through my relationship to creation care.
Yeah. Oh, that is just so beautiful. And I so appreciate your your language and how you, both of you, describe how these things go together. And there's so much that those of us who are not Jewish can learn from that. And so I wanted to jump to talking a little bit about, we are, of course, experiencing weather disasters, climate disasters, increasing both in severity and in number, and it can be fairly traumatic and can be fear-producing. But we know that when one of the ways that we can, I don't like the word combat, but one of the ways that we can heal or deal with the effects of climate change that we're seeing in the news and all of the eco-grief, climate anxiety, is by, as one of my elderly church members said, digging in the dirt is very healing. And so I wonder if you all can share a little bit, Justin, let's start with you, about how farming is good for the earth. As a climate practice, as well as really for your own, you've already talked a little bit about it, but your own spirit in these difficult times.
Yeah. I want to just acknowledge that a majority of the farming that happens in this country is not good for the earth, ultimately. And so, not all farming is equal in those ways. So I think the evolution of farming under capitalism and the commoditization of food has significantly influenced how people relate to why we grow food. And because of, and it existed before many of the climate crises that we're experiencing, but is certainly exacerbating issue of global hunger. With that relationship of commoditization of food becoming an inspiration for production, it also commoditizes the land on which we grow food. Jewish wisdom, not uniquely, many wisdom traditions throughout the world have an understanding that no human owns land, right? The entire concept of private property is an illusion. It's an imagined reality. It's not actually possible. And so there are not new concepts in farming, but really very quite old concepts in farming, that the relationship is framed around an energetic exchange, not a spiritual energetic exchange, an actual, by consuming produce from the earth, we are taking from it and it needs to be restored, right? So soil nutrient depletion over the last 100 years is mind-boggling.
Yes.
Right. That the more food we grow, the less nutritious it becomes, given if done with certain practices. And so we at the farming project in Western North Carolina that I'm involved in, Yesod Farm+Kitchen, we strive our best to engage in regenerative agricultural practices, which, simply put, as it sounds, is very conscious and active in regenerating soil. And so in vegetable farming, it might not look terribly different than other forms of organic farming, but where it really is a marked change is in animal rearing and the way that animals are pastured. And so much of how we grow food is not reflective of how food grows in nature. Much of how we farm animals is not reflective of how animals behave in nature. And so the pasturing and grazing practices connected to regenerative agriculture mimic wild herds. And so instead of having a wide open expanse in which large numbers of animals are given free access, it's smaller groups of animals that are actively moved through a pasture on a certain rotation. And that ecosystem that develops of the animals trampling the food that they don't want to eat, consuming the food that they do want to eat, fertilizing the land as they go, and so on and so forth, is how the earth works on its own when we don't intervene, right? So I think the Raphi made an allusion to a Jewish folk tale, a kind of imagined interpretation of conversation between God and the first human. And the story goes that when God created the Garden of Eden, God took the first human. And also important to note that Adam, which we all understand to be this character of the first human, is not actually a name in the Torah. It's a description. And the word itself implies this connection to soil, this connection to ground, Adamah, right? So Adam is of Adamah. And so that story of being created from soil. So God is taking the first human through the Garden of Eden and showing it all of the vegetation and trees. And as Raphi said, God says to the first human, this is the world that I made for you. Don't screw up my world. Don't mess it up. And if you do, there's no one who's going to come after you to fix it. So that imperative of understanding that it is human obligation to care for not the sustainability of creation, but the regeneration of creation, right? Which is an important nuance of, if we are in service and serving and stewarding in true stewardship, it's not enough to just keep it as it is, but to consistently provide for it as it provides for us.
Yeah. Raphi, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I could not agree more with everything that you just said, Justin. I think that all of that is so important to remember, especially that last point about Adam being from the earth and Adamah, like that connection in the name, and this being our responsibility, obligation, but not just responsibility and obligation, the very definition of humanity. This is what we were put on this earth to do. We were brought from this earth to take care of the earth that we're on. And I think that it's such an important distinction to make between doing that and fulfilling our definition as human beings and what a lot of farmers in this country are doing right now, which is very devastating. And making that distinction between agriculture that's for productivity and for profit, which there is such an incentive for right now because of global hunger and because people do need to be fed, but is also very harmful to the earth. And I've gotten to experience 4 different farms this past year, all of which are small regenerative farms, practicing things like sequestering soil from the carbon, making sure those nutrients, carbon from the soil, making sure those nutrients get into the crops, composting, using whatever resources are available, not just taking from here and there, but really using what's at hand, which is what we're meant to do. We're not meant to import things from all over the world, all corners of the earth to where we are, but planting native plants, planting what would naturally grow in that area. And it's been really amazing to see that, and to see people who are not just kind of having a neutral effect on the earth, not people who are just trying to reduce carbon footprint and things like that, but really having a positive effect, doing something that's actively good. And I think that does have a very healing effect on the earth. But also it's had a pretty healing effect on me specifically as a person, and as a farmer. And like, apart from what regenerative farming does tangibly for the environment and literally healing damage, it definitely has a healing effect on the farmer. Like, growing up in New York City, it was very difficult to appreciate nature on a daily basis. And I'm thinking back to what Justin said about seeing that shift between beautiful areas of nature growing up and then those turning into industrial malls and things and factories and things like that. And I have seen that shift less because, like, by the time I was growing up, the shift was almost already made. So I can mostly only imagine what it would have been like for many of the areas I was used to growing up to have once been places of natural beauty and places that had things growing. So sometimes I would do climate work, and I started in high school, and I started doing all of this because I was terrified of what was happening to our earth, and I was young, and I was thinking, this is my future, but this is also my present. Climate change is here now. What am I going to do about it? We have a deadline. Oh no. And all of those thoughts were just going around and around. So I started doing climate work, and it was often really hard to remember what I was doing it for. And like a lot of climate activists, I would experience burnout, which I know is a very common thing. And I think that doing this past year has really reminded me that there is still so much worth saving, and that this fight is not over. And I've gotten to engage with nature on a daily basis, see where food comes from, learn a lot about what it means to take care of the land, what the land actually needs from us. And so it's very convenient that one of the ways that you can actively help the climate is through regenerative farming, because it kind of reminds the person why you're helping while you're helping, which is very, very useful. And it's also just very fulfilling work. And so if you're being fulfilled while you're kind of helping the climate, and while you're engaging in climate activism, it's much, much easier to keep going. So yeah, I think that those are some of the really wonderful ways in which regenerative farming and small farming and just being present with the land, although certainly not available as an option to everyone, when you do have it available as an option, is something that can really change the way that your mind works. And I've really loved that this past year.
Yeah. Oh, I so appreciate this time with you all, and we don't have much time left, but I would like for us to think about, not all of us, as you just said, Raphi, live on land where we can actively farm. And some of us live in suburbs, some of us live in urban areas where we may not even have the ability to have, like a pot on a patio. But what are things that we can do? You said one of them, which is composting. I think that there's even urban composting that can happen now. And I've always had I love composting. I think it's such an incredible experience to throw your food scraps and your leaves and whatnot and paper, and come up with this beautiful soil that you can then add to your garden or whatever. But besides composting, what are things that individual folks who are watching this might be able to participate in, or should keep in mind as they are wanting to help heal the earth? So much, you've said, Raphi, so much of climate work is stressful, right? And so much of what we're constantly teaching people is like, don't do this, stop this. And so one of the beautiful things about farming, gardening, yard work, or work in nature, is that instead of stop doing this, it's a positive, right? It's a healing for the spirit and for the earth. And so both of you, what things would you pass on? What information would you pass on to others who are listening of ways they can get involved and help heal the earth? Just jump in.
I definitely have, a few ways that I've noticed, because farming wasn't really in the cards for me up until now, and probably won't be for me again in the future. I would say, first of all, in terms of more hands-on approaches of restoring creation, even in urban areas, there are some local gardens, local farms, things like that. And I would say, look those up, do some research if possible on your own, see if you can volunteer there, educate yourself about the specific food systems and agriculture in your local area. Because getting involved hands-on is great motivation for climate work, but it's also just not realistic for every human being. And so if that just doesn't make sense for where you're at in life, that's really understandable. And there are still things you can do as an individual. And I would say the most important thing from my perspective would probably be to join some sort of a larger climate movement. Because climate change is primarily a systemic issue that's being fueled by large corporations. And so to work against that, we need strong, positive systems of our own to fight against the systems that are having a negative effect. So I would say join movements who lobby for environmental legislation or focusing on mobilizing larger communities, because maybe you can't plant a garden in your backyard all by yourself, but maybe you can work with your community members to get one planted behind your synagogue or other place of worship or a school or something like that. Or sustainable electricity sources might not be accessible for you in your home personally, but maybe you could work to get solar panels at your workplace or at school. And really, the reason why I'm a member of the Jewish Youth Climate Movement is because a movement provides both a lot of other people who are getting things done alongside of you. So it's both more effective, but it's also a community, which tends to have kind of the same healing effect that hands-on regenerative farming has, because when whole communities are taking action together, it just feels a lot more fulfilling. It feels a lot more meaningful. And so it's just more gratifying to take action, which is important for individuals for motivation. So I would say my biggest tip would be joining in with other people, seeing if there are any movements that are local to your area or fit with who you are as a person. So if you're a Jewish youth, you join the Jewish Youth Climate Movement, just as an example. But there are plenty of other youth climate movements and non-youth climate movements, and non-Jewish climate movements and non-faith related climate movements, because I think that when you join together in communities, you can work to transform that specific community, and then slowly as communities get transformed, the world will eventually transform along with those communities. So that would be my biggest piece of advice.
That's awesome. Justin, what would you add?
I think my responses are going to be a little bit different. I just want to name Raphi. Thank you so much for sharing the wisdom that you have, and it's really beautiful to see whose hands the future is in. Honestly, I think the most important thing that any person can do in confronting climate crisis is to be in awe of creation and to hold space to be in deeper relationship with it every chance that we have. And I also want to name, as important is to be in a space of cultivating gratitude for farmers, even the farmers that are engaging in industrial food production. Most of them are doing it because of need, necessity, or, and I think this is also important, Jewish tradition teaches to hold contradiction side by side, and respect multiple truths. Many people who are engaged in industrial farming actually do believe that its practices will feed the world. I happen to believe that they're wrong, right? But to remember that in order to impact that systemic change that Raphi is so eloquently speaking to, we need to be in relationship with all of the different ideas of what it looks like to confront all of the different challenges that we have. And while backyard composting is super fun and everyone should do it, and like cured my kind of queasiness around bugs and insects and worms, like there are so many great reasons to do backyard compost. No one's backyard compost is going to change the crises that we're going to be confronting in the next unknown number of years. And so these things are important to do, and they're fun to do, and they're great to do in community, as Raphi said. And I really do believe that when we open ourselves into that space of amazement and awe in the presence of the natural world, which we are a part of, we are not separate from, right? Also in Hebrew, in modern Hebrew, there is, but in ancient Hebrew, there's no word for nature, right? Like it is just, we're in it, we are it, right? To find those connections, maybe it's slowing down and looking at a tree that you never really noticed how beautiful it was in that particular light, or whatever it is. Even those of us in urban environments, we experience the natural world. Maybe it's just the way the cloud passes past behind a building, but that leads us, especially with that gratitude to farmers, I think, to deepen our relationship to those systems and how it is that we participate in them, which hopefully we all are able to make those small incremental changes in our own lives of reducing our impact. But I think rather than to start from that place of fear and that place of defeat, because I think many of us approach this as if we've already lost. One thing I think that Jewish wisdom really has to offer all people confronting these crises is the importance of perseverance and adaptability. in the face of uncertainty, right? And those teachings of, this is the only world, don't screw it up, and so many others, the idea that we don't really own property because of our own mortality, and all of these different questions could be looked at as a place of, oh my God, I'm afraid to break it, but is also an invitation to learn how to fix it. Yeah. And I think coming into that active role in abating climate change however we can, we need to be compassionate with ourselves and be giving to ourselves too. Like, none of us alone. There's a wonderful teaching that I think is really inspirational for me, that it is not incumbent on any individual to finish the work, meaning the work of healing the world and pursuing justice. It's not, none of us have the individual responsibility to finish that work. But all of us, every single one of us, is obligated to participate in its pursuit.
Yes.
And so that to me is as important as changing our light bulbs and getting solar panels when we can. Yeah. To be in relationship.
Be in relationship. Yes. Well, thank you so much, Justin. Thank you so much, Raphi. This has just been so amazing for me, such a blessing for me personally, and I'm sure for all those who are listening. And so I thank you. And I want to encourage those who are watching to check out the description below and tell us what you think. We will put some resources for you there. Engage with us also online using the hashtag, again, Let's Talk Climate. And be sure to subscribe and follow Blessed Tomorrow for the latest thoughtful leadership, resources, and episodes on climate action and advocacy. And so from all of us at ecoAmerica and Blessed Tomorrow, thank you for being with us. People of faith are the perfect leaders for climate solutions, and we all stand on God's holy ground together. We need everyone, every day. Thank you.